You hear me? So we're going to get started. We're going to get started pretty quickly. So if there's a seat that you can find, sit in it. If you want to sit but you can't find a seat, there's an overflow room with this being electronically tossed your way just across the hall. Here? Huh. Is that better? So just to repeat one thing, if you'd like to sit down but you can't find a seat, there's an overflow room over here across the center. And there are seats in there, and it's streamed there. So, okay. All right. I think we're ready to start. So it's wonderful to see so many people. I'm not a bit surprised. Today is our day to remember Bob Stacey and recognize his contributions to Oregon. Several of us will offer thoughts about Bob and his work. Then we will gather for refreshments afterwards and more interesting Bob stories that probably shouldn't be told except in semi-privacy. We begin with an intimate portrait of Bob as father and grandfather. Daughter Hesper and her sons Bruno and Archer Norman will read a poem that was written for Bob by Kim Stafford, and they'll show you some photos. Hesper?
Hi. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm Hesper. These are my kids. This is Bruno and Archer. They were really close to their Papa, my dad. Bruno could make Papa laugh like no one else. That kind of surprised laugh that kind of catches you off guard. Archer was incredibly helpful during my dad's kind of last months. He filled Papa's pillbox every single week and gave him just the world's best hugs. And thank you all so much for being here. I feel honored to read this tribute by Kim Stafford. And I don't think she's here, but we'd like to thank our friend Betty Denny, who set the words to the images. Friend of thousands yet unborn, for Bob Stacey. I think there's a slideshow, but I don't know how to control it. Am I in charge of the slideshow? Oh, okay. A city is a place where we have decided to be together. Yes? Oh, okay. A city is a place where we have decided to be together. It is rain in a bowl. It is treasure contained. A farm, a forest, a wild hill form the rim of this treasure, the setting for a precious pearl. A city bristles in its glory, a bouquet of wonders. But the wild periphery makes the city matter. We had one who looked up from now to see time's horizon, to say, let's work, as if in the early days of a better way to be together here. Some may say he's gone. I say his work is in our hands. Seedlings of thought, visions strong as steel. If we miss him, we will be his emissaries from the future, come back to lay a foundation for the city we want to be. In his spirit, we will believe visions have outcomes and dreams can shape our luck. In his shadow of blessing, We are the people deciding how best to be together here. Missing him, may our grief be our resolve. Thank you.
As most of you know, I followed Bob's, as did most of you, I followed Bob's long fight for his life. I realized it was only a matter of time, but losing him was still a grievous heartbreak. I met Bob at law school. I was drawn to his formidable intellect and how lightly he carried it. I thought it would be fun to work with him, and we got an opportunity our first term at law school. We'd heard there was a lawyer trying to stop approval of a sprawling shopping mall across the river from downtown Eugene. We signed on to help. We lost, and the city center has suffered ever since. But Bob and I had a good time. After that, we did a lot of things together. We sired daughters, his and Adrian's Hesper, and my late wife Nancy's Janine, who's here today. Hesper's here today too, of course. They were born on the same day in the same hospital, and Adrian and Nancy shared a recovery room. Bob and I went to the same law school. In first year, we volunteered at the Oregon Student Public Interest Research Group. We were both assigned to Augsburg attorney Henry Richmond. Under his tutelage, we enjoyed tweaking underperforming state agencies. Henry was much more fun than trusts and estates at law school. Henry left Augsburg and founded 1,000 Friends of Oregon in 1975. He wanted to hire Bob and me as staff attorneys, but first we had to pass the bar exam. We sat next to each other for the exam, of course. My experience was normal. Bob's was exciting. With a half hour to go, an official handed Bob a note. He handed it to me, jumped up, and raced out of his unfinished exam to greet just-born daughter Amanda. He passed the bar anyway. He must have aced the first 3 quarters. We started lawyering with Henry in a house on Southeast Belmont Street. We shared the single 10-pound black phone on our desks. These were desks that faced one another so we could share the phone. Bob and I, and Adrian and Nancy, of course, purchased houses within the year. The Stacey house was in Southeast, the Benner house was in Northeast, but we coordinated addresses. His was 3434 Southeast Brooklyn. Mine was 3535 Northeast 27th. Once the Oregon Growth Management Program got its legs, we left Thousand Friends and went on different paths. We were together those years, but we worked differently. I was serious. Bob was semi-serious. I could see he was having more fun. I took a lesson not to take myself too seriously. Fresh out of law school, we needed to learn how to argue persuasively. So we'd go to each other's court appearances. I marveled at Bob's logic and his unassailable arguments. We lost all our cases at circuit courts in county seats around the state where judges and lawyers drink at the same bars. But we won back most of those cases at the Court of Appeals. Bob was the first to argue at the Oregon Supreme Court. It involved a Lane County decision to allow a lumber mill outside the Eugene urban growth boundary. I went to watch. A justice interrupted him with a distressing observation. Mr. Stacey, this is a timber state. I was speechless. Bob was not speechless. Yes, Your Honor, he said, but even the timber industry is subject to state planning laws. Our careers diverged. I missed Bob's intelligence and wit. I was in the Metro lawyer's office when he was elected to the Metro Council, but I retired just before Bob was seated. We would have had a grand time. I did long stints at several places, the Gorge Commission, LCDC, and Metro. Bob had a different approach. He did short stints. He tried everything, from Osberg to City Commissioner Earl Blumenauer, to Portland Planning Director, to TriMet, to Governor Roberts' office, to the Ball-Janik Law Firm, to Congressman Blumenauer, and finally to Metro. At every position he held, he made significant contributions to the Oregon we know today. Thanks to his efforts, the 1980s slogan of the Tourism Bureau remains true. Things look different here. So following me is Steve Stacey, Bob's brother, who helped Adrian care for Bob.
I'm Bob Stacey's brother. Beginning in 1953, our family moved at least 10 times in the 16 years the four of us were together. Dad was in the Army. Mom was a saint and a logistics expert. By the time we moved in 1958 near Mount Clemens, Michigan, we had moved 4 times in 5 years, including El Paso, Texas, and 2 stops in Germany, Mainz and Wiesbaden. We never spent as much time in one place as a family as we did in Michigan. Bob and I played board games, card games, any game with written rules. Bob was always eager to read and interpret the rules for me. He was a reader. Bob read anything and everything, even cereal boxes at breakfast. Bob was also competitive. It was not until many years later that I realized that Bob beat me so often, at least in part, because he was the only one who could read at the time. In grade school and high school, Bob played sports, was active in theater, wrote for the school newspaper, and oh yes, was a very good student. Following my older brother in school often resulted in a new teacher saying, "Oh, I hope you are as good a student as Bobby." As competitive as we were, I knew that when we were together, I was never the smartest one in the room. We moved from Michigan to Texas, then to Anniston, Alabama. In 1964, we were there 10 days. Long enough for the segregation in the Deep South to be made very real to Bob and me. Dad was then assigned again to Germany. The Army didn't allow our family to travel together, so at the end of the school year, Mom, Bob, and I traveled via Greyhound bus from Portland to New York. We were able to ride the subway to the 1964 World's Fair before sailing across the Atlantic to Bremerhaven, Germany. It was the 1960s version of mass transit all rolled into one trip. In Germany, Bob rode the yellow school bus to Frankfurt American High School. Bob played football and basketball at Hanau, where we lived. As a junior at Franklin, he was co-editor of the school newspaper. Quite often, a deadline would require Bob to stay late and come home on the train, foreshadowing his work with TriMet. Dad was sent to Korea, so Mom packed us up and we returned to Portland for spring quarter 1967, and then Bob's senior year at Park Rose High School. After graduating from Park Rose, Bob realized his dream of going to Reed College. No mention of Bob's college days would be complete without bringing up his criminal record. While at Reed, Bob was involved in a demonstration against the war in Vietnam. Bob was arrested for jaywalking in downtown Portland near the Army Recruiting Center. That was not unusual. The war was very unpopular. What was unusual was that our dad was working at the recruiting center. Bob said he went there to make sure there was no trouble. Dad said it was a good thing that Reed College had bail bond service to get demonstrators out of jail. Our parents were back, thanks to the U.S. Army, again in Anniston, Alabama, during my freshman year at OSU and Bob's third year at Reed. Bob and I were going to visit them during Christmas break 1970. The night before the flight, Bob told me about this girl he had met. When we got to our parents' house, Bob announced that he was getting married that spring. Our parents were very surprised and asked about Adrian. Tough questions, like, do you have a picture of this woman? Well, no, Bob didn't have a picture. As many of you know, they were married May 1st, 1971. They celebrated their 51st anniversary last spring. In 1975, you've heard part of this, after law school in Eugene, Bob and a very pregnant Adrian stayed at our parents' house in Portland while Bob took the bar exam. As the lawyers here know, the bar exam took place over 2 days. The evening after the first day of the exam, Adrian's water broke. Amanda was not willing to wait any longer to be born. Mom drove Adrian to Eugene that night. Bob took the rest of the bar exam the next day while Amanda was being born. When the bar exam results were announced, Bob had passed the bar. Bob was very focused and wicked smart. It is the cruelest of life's ironies that tumors around Bob's beautiful brain would ultimately be the cause of his death. In the 3 months since he passed, I have thought of so many things I want to ask or tell Bob. I love my big brother, and I'll always miss him. Rest in peace, Bobby G.
Earl Blumenauer is congressman for Oregon's 3rd District. He knew talent when he encountered it and plucked Bob from Thousand Friends to staff his Portland City Commission's office. Earl.
We've got the podium equipped. This is a tough act to follow. And you look around, so much of Oregon's history is right here. And as I look at all of you, I have more optimism, even though Monday I'm going to go back to those idiots in the Republican caucus. And in their wisdom, the first thing they're going to do is eliminate proxy voting with a 4-vote margin in the COVID stream. Nancy Pelosi could manage it with remote voting and her powers of persuasion. Kevin McCarthy is no Nancy Pelosi. And I think we should all just buckle up, take our popcorn, enjoy as they slowly work their way out of the majority. Part of what we need to do is reflect on Bob's sense of humor. And he willingly allowed us to take him away after he finished the Portland Marathon on his 40th birthday in an ambulance. Didn't bat an eye. Now, Mr. Benner told me that Portlanders talk the fastest of anybody in the country. And I've been trying to go over this to get under the limit, and I couldn't do it. I have to cut my favorite joke that Bob told about the priest, the lawyer, and the planner. Catch up with me later. He told it really well. The reference was made to Bob's peripatetic career. How many of you have been to more than 10 of his goodbye parties? Now, some would say it was because he couldn't maintain a job. In a couple of occasions, that may be the case, but no. You know, he grew up in an era of baseball when the Brooklyn Dodgers finally won the World Series in 1955. And there were major stars, Duke Snider, Roy Campanella, Pee Wee Reese. But there was a guy on that team, Junior Gilliam. And none of you know him, or a few of you maybe. But he was an amazing, what they call utility infield. He could play second base, shortstop, third base, with all-star capacity, and if necessary, could fill in center field or first base. Bob is our metropolitan Junior Gilliam. Like Junior being the glue that held the Brooklyn Dodgers together, Bob's played that role here in so many different capacities. It's not a sign of instability, but curiosity and an amazing capacity to do almost anything he set his mind to. You left out his 2 tours at 1,000 Friends, Richard, in your list.
That's how it started.
And I won't repeat the honor roll of places that he played his regional glue position so very well. He wasn't flashy, but he could be very persistent and passionate and deliver spellbinding resolutions on things that he cared about. But more than his persuasive abilities, he may not have been a fast talker, but he was a slow listener. It gave the rest of us a chance to kind of catch up with him. A sign of respect and his ability to synthesize. I think the best example of his amazing skills was his willingness to accept the assignment as planning director at the city of Portland. In a tough time, Bud Clark had the police chief of the week. We had serious problems in terms of finance. We had a central city plan that kind of lost its way. Bob stepped up and was able to put those pieces together. He understood that professional planners are artists pretending to be bureaucrats. They had strong feelings about what was right and what was good for you, and an allegiance to a city code that was a half century out of date. And Bob was able to work with those folks, to be able to understand how to fashion complex solutions in a collaborative fashion in a way that was, I think, unprecedented. He finished the major assignments on time under budget in a way that I, to this day, think was remarkable. And there are a number of Alumni Association members here who had the privilege of working with him. And I think showing his best instincts. A number of these professional planners, bureaucrats, transportation professionals, were keepers of the flame. There are a number of the flame keepers here who met regularly for years, keeping the spirit of what Portland had done earlier, keeping that flame alive. Bob kept the flame alive to the end. He helps all of us be an example of keeping that flame. For that, I thank him and hope that we will, in a small way, be able to honor his memory by doing our part to keep that flame alive.
Robert Liberty met Bob at the U of O, same place I met him, where they were active at Augsburg. Both served as attorneys and as executive directors of Thousand Friends. Both staffed Congressman Blumenauer and were attorneys in private practice. Both served on the Metro Council from District 6. Both were Loeb Fellows at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. For 18 years, they were neighbors. Robert?
Tom, I think we're going to switch. I could tell one of the jokes that Bob told while we're waiting for the technology to boot up, but it is a mixed crowd. Is it?
Robert, is this a PowerPoint that you show us?
Yes. So I will say something. When Dick and Bob and I were working at Thousand Friends, so this is extemporaneous, we started joking and laughing so much that our sides ached, and Henry would come hurrying down the hall to look in. And any other boss might have been concerned about two staff attorneys goofing off when there was a pile of litigation underway. But in fact, he was just jealous. And we had many times where we laughed really hard. Dick was part of that, all the staff, because the work was very hard and high stakes and high pressure. In fact, I'm going to keep going until we get this set up. At one point, I had to borrow his car. I didn't own a car, and I had a meeting in Salem. Is that it? Are we ready? Well, you'll have to hear that story a little bit later. The results of Bob Stacey's long career can be seen, felt, and experienced across Oregon in many different places and in many different ways. What I share with you today is of necessity only a sampling of what he accomplished. Next.
Finish the story.
In the 1970s, Bob helped ensure that the land use laws protected Oregon's wonderful coastal lakes. Next. In the 1970s and 80s, Bob participated in litigation, lobbying, policymaking, and politics to protect the beautiful and productive farmlands of Oregon from the Rogue Valley to next, the Willamette Valley. Next, Bob passionately believed in the value of increasing transportation choices, walking,
biking, and transit. Next. Since the 1960s, transportation planners have been working to build a spiderweb of freeways through and around the Portland region, as has been done in the rest of the country. By the late 1980s, the next step in that plan was to build the Western Bypass, the first phase in a Western Outer Beltway. The Western Bypass, next, was never built, in large part because as advisor to Governor Barbara Roberts, Bob helped ensure that the alternative, an integrated approach emphasizing mixed-use neighborhoods and transit developed by Thousand Friends of Oregon, was adopted instead. Next. In the years before and during his service on the Metro Council, Bob continued to argue for better transportation alternatives with added urgency based on his recognition that building and widening freeways, next, like the proposal to massively widen Interstate 5 across the Columbia River, contributed directly, indirectly, and profoundly to climate change. Next. It is hard to remember now, but when Bob became planning director of Portland, the city had experienced 3 decades of population stagnation. Much of downtown was parking lots and inner neighborhoods were declining. Bob helped Portland rethink how the city could grow in ways that made it more urbane, but remained affordable, and honor the state's commitment to compact urbanization. The fruits of that effort are now dramatically evident today. Next. Consider the transformation of an area of empty warehouses and a contaminated rail yard, next, into the Pearl District, where, by the way, about 1/5 of the housing units have been built to serve people and families of moderate income. And you can see the results of his work in neighborhoods where arterials, which were once lined with parking lots and decaying businesses, next, and next, today are the hearts of thriving, walkable, renewed neighborhoods. Next. And next. Oregon's urban growth boundaries were required around every city, big or small in Oregon, a bedrock of our 50-year-old planning program. Bob spent years working across the state to make the novel concept of urban growth boundaries mean something, to use them to really change the pattern of development. Next. In his, that's fine. No, that's fine. In his 1979 legal challenge to the proposed urban growth boundary for the Portland metropolitan region, Bob attacked it as being based on, quote, the assumption that sprawl will continue inside the boundary and existing exclusionary zoning will remain in effect. A zoning pattern which, if perpetuated, will prevent Portland region from providing adequate numbers of affordable housing units. Challenging the American pattern of suburban sprawl was a David versus Goliath battle. But this one lasted years, unlike the biblical battle that was over in minutes. We know who won those battles. Next. Here's an image published by the New York Times a few years ago. It is called a figure ground, familiar to architects and urban designers. All the structures, the buildings, are what you see in black. Next. And here is the same figure ground for Charlotte, North Carolina, at the same scale and covering about the same population. Dramatically, radically different. But you don't need a figure ground or a line on a map to find the urban growth boundary. Next. Here's what part of our regional urban growth boundary looks like in Google Earth, a crisp separation of city and country. Oregon cities have taken a different trajectory away from the sprawl endemic in the United States. We have made great progress creating compact traditional communities with next, more housing choices everywhere, next, leading to a more racially and economically integrated region. Next. And when all of Oregonians' decades of work, including certainly all the work of people in this room to create a better Oregon, from coastal lakes that are conserved to urban growth boundaries, were almost undone at the ballot box in 2004. Next, Bob helped pull together the campaign to pass Measure 49 to restore our planning laws and to keep Oregon livable and lovable, in the words of Oregon Governor Tom McCall, the patron saint of Oregon's planning program. Next. McCall famously said, heroes are not statues framed against a red sky. They are people who say, this is my community, and it's my responsibility to make it better. Next. Next. Bob was one of those heroes. We are a fundamentally different and better place in our city, our region, and our state because of Bob Stacey's lifetime of leadership.
Grace Kernigan worked in the transportation field as director of the Oregon Department of Transportation in similar positions in the state of Washington. She and Bob and Robert were among the first in the U.S. to recognize the critical connection between land use and transportation planning and put it into practice. Grace?
I was kind of making fun of Robert when he went up there, but I realized I have all of the wonk he had, but none of the pretty pictures to go with it. So I'm sorry. It was a lovely presentation, both of you. I was asked today to describe for you Bob's activities in a little-known group of bureaucrats. Earl just outed us, but from the late 70s called the Flames. And I'll get into that in a minute. But before I do, I wanted to explain how I first met Bob, which was in the 1979 Oregon legislative session. Michael Houston from the League of Oregon Cities had introduced us because I was a newbie junior legislative liaison for the city of Salem. And Michael and Bob had formed an alliance with some land use issues. I don't recall the details of it, but they were trying to educate me so that I would help the city take a position that would lobby, that would give them some votes for whatever Thousand Friends was advocating for. Bob created his own little team of city folks from around the state to enhance the coalition with 1,000 Friends. And I remember he seemed a little awkward as a lobbyist, but smart as a whip on the content of the program. And perhaps a little arrogant. None of those 1,000 Friends people would ever be called arrogant, I'm sure. But he was so very committed to his beliefs. He was an intelligent and very patient teacher, and I was just trying to finish my graduate program at Willamette. And I found him carrying his little hippie briefcase all the way around the legislature. It was glued to his arm. But it was his dry wit and sense of humor, to me, anyone that could explain the Oregon land use planning in kind of an elevator conversation, describe it, keep it fascinating, had my vote from the very beginning. In the end, though, for me, it wasn't his intelligence or his wit, but it was integrity that Bob had to the qualities and the values that he held dear that I appreciate the most. But now I'll get back to the Flames. Okay. So after we went our separate ways, I was fortunate to have some time with Bob at the city of Portland. For several years, he was part of a group of 5 of us that got together initially to provide input to a contact we had in Senator Moynihan's office. The senator was drafting federal legislation to fundamentally change the structure of the federal highway and transit programs. And our DC contact was very interested in how Oregon has integrated its land use and transportation programs and how our regional government and metropolitan planning worked together. He wanted to reinforce those concepts in the new federal legislation, which became known as ICE-T. The 5 kindred spirits began to explain specifically how the land use laws set the backdrop for transportation planning, and how our transit and our highway programs were integrated, and why there was a difference between Metro and JPAC. Some of you should take note of that. And how unofficial processes like the Feeney meetings that we had played a role in our success. And the group consisted of Bob, who was working for Earl at the time at the city, Andy Catugno from Metro, Ethan Seltzer from Metro and later from Portland State, Steve Daughter, who's back in the back, and I saw Andy over here, I don't know if Ethan's here, and Steve and I were from the City of Portland's Office of Transportation. Though we took pride in repping Oregon to Washington, D.C., we could see that our region was not living up to its reputation, nor meeting our own expectations of ourselves. At some point, we stopped looking at others to lead and decided that we were just as responsible for the region's future as anyone else. So, thinking of ourselves as keeper of the flame, we called ourselves the Flame Group. maybe we were, I don't know, it was a bit much, huh? Anyway, though we took pride, we continued to meet once a month at the city conference rooms with takeout lunches, and we rotated responsibilities for bringing something of interest to contribute toward making the region better. We'd take our ideas that we picked up, back to our jobs and try to improve things. Ultimately, Bob came to lead the city's planning bureau, as Earl noted, and brought many opportunities to the table to discuss. I think he thrived with the little cadre we'd put together. We all enjoyed a trip to Toronto to gather ideas for a fresh model for regional planning. It was brain food, which he never got enough of, and it was bringing the theoretical and the practical together. It also helped him navigate the politics, which he enjoyed being a part of, but from my viewpoint, yet still didn't sort of seem first nature to him. The Flame Group fed his intellect, gave him a team to help move things forward, and was just pure fun. It was a place where he could throw out his sarcastic observations of the system and use his dry wit to spontaneous quips to entertain us. It was also very productive for the region. In 1992, we produced a framework, you're going to love this, called Elements of an Oregon Vision for Metropolitan Growth. Thank you, Steve, for finding the document so I could quote it. Here comes the scintillating part. It had headings for things such as centers and subcenters, regional rail network, affordable housing overlays, housing on main streets above commercial, infill housing without disrupting existing neighborhoods, metropolitan green spaces, and coordinating bus hubs with housing investments. So we weren't running for office at the time, so the language kind of spoke to us. It wasn't exactly catching. Each of us took the template, though, back to our respective organizations to incorporate our planning and to incorporate them into our planning and into our infrastructure investments. Earl liked the group so much, he became a flame too. Bob's habit of banding together with groups of collaborators served the city, the state, this region very well. Whether at 1,000 Friends, where Bob tutored many, including the young Lynn Peterson, or organizing downstate cities, lobbyists, or collaborating with the Flames, he neither sought credit nor spent any time worrying about it, as far as I know. Harry Truman said, it's amazing what you can accomplish when you do not care who gets the credit. That was Bob. He moved us, I told you, Steve, I couldn't do this without. He moved us forward by holding his beliefs and learning to play well with others. In the end, I think we are here today not because of extreme intellect and wit, but because this man engaged in the contact sport of government while holding on to his integrity and keeping the flames of his beliefs alive. Thank you so much, Bob, Stacey. We love you. Thank you.
Nolan Leinhardt is a principal and director of planning and urban design at Zimmer Gunsel Frasca in Portland. He served 13 years on the board of 1,000 Friends and had many opportunities to work with Bob. Nolan?
Thank you, Dick. I'm so honored to be with all of you here today to celebrate Bob's life and contributions. Looking out into this room, I'm reminded of the adage that a man is judged by the company he keeps. And this wonderful group is a testament to Bob's friendship and what a great leader he was for our region and our state. I first met Bob in the summer of 2001. It was my first job out of college working for Earl Blumenauer in Washington, D.C. Earl had convinced Bob to return to D.C. as chief of staff, as he mentioned, just before I arrived, on what he had planned to be a short-term engagement. Working on Capitol Hill was not one of Bob's dreams, but he did it for Earl, and he did it for Oregon. We were so lucky for it. The strength of their friendship and the respect for one another was always on display, whether it was engaging in policy discussions or cracking each other up with endless pun battles. Bob was absolutely the right guy in the right place at the right time in so many ways. with a member of Congress flying back and forth from coast to coast, running from the House floor to committee meetings, Chief of Staff is a bit of a keeper of the culture, and Bob did that beautifully. Maybe most importantly, he helped infuse the office with a sense of Oregon and Portland values and identity that was core to Earl's approach in Congress. He was most certainly the only congressional staff pulling his bike through security, covered in sweat from a sweaty, humid August DC morning, wearing a t-shirt that said, "One less car." Bob made the office fun. His sense of humor was infectious, and it set a tone that seemed rare among the many stuffy congressional offices. Only Bob could convince most of the office to install SETI software to assist in the search for extraterrestrial life. Almost every computer in the office. Many of the best lines of our sitcom office experience were documented by a colleague who kept and still has a quote book of funny exchanges. No surprise, Bob is the main character. In one excerpt, a group of Earl's staff was leaving a bar following the viewing of an Oregon Ducks game, rowdy and loud, and somebody passing asked, "Who do you all work for?" Without missing a beat, Bob deadpanned, "The president, George W. Bush." This sense of humor, but also Bob's calm, caring demeanor, helped us all through crises that now seem unbelievable. He was the one who closed the office and sent us out of the building on 9/11. He had the delicate task of setting up and overseeing a procedure to open mail during a subsequent anthrax scare on Capitol Hill. It was a terrifying time, and his leadership made it easier for all of us. More than anything, Bob's intellect and knowledge were amazing. I learned so much from working with him, and I adored him. It was apparent enough that Freya Thorson and Mandy Osborne started calling me Bob's mini-me. I've never been called mini before that. But following my time in Earl's office, I went off to graduate school for planning. And being from Oregon and having worked with Bob and Earl, that went from kind of a novelty to being a moment of sympathy after the passage of Measure 37. My land use professor assured me that was the end of Oregon's legendary land use system. So when I returned to Oregon after grad school, it was between Measure 37 and Measure 49. Bob was touring the state with the Envision Oregon program, and I remember sitting down with him at Bijou, and he described the challenge of ongoing education, which is never over. That so many people moved to Oregon, or even grew up here, without understanding that land use is part of what has made Oregon special. He transferred from Envision Oregon, which set the stage for Measure 49, and Bob worked tirelessly to build the case, raise funds, and coordinate a massive amount of grassroots engagement. One of his colleagues on the campaign described his role not just as a leader, but as the nerve center of the effort. I was thrilled to do my small part volunteering on the campaign, and afterwards, Bob invited me onto the board of 1,000 Friends of Oregon. There too, I watched Bob convey knowledge, but also strategy, always having a clear vision, but a strong eye for the possible and the political. I learned from Bob and watched him mentor others to do such important work. And I recently spoke to a few 1,000 Friends former staff members who noted that every staff meeting felt like the Bob Stacey show. An education session mixed with a comedy routine, complete with impersonations of key players in whichever story would best convey the historical, political, or legal principle at hand. One of them reflected my experience in DC when she said she didn't feel like she needed a graduate degree after working with Bob because she learned so much. In his role at 1,000 Friends and in elected office, I came to see his consistent mentorship of the next generation. He was patient, generous, always willing to share knowledge and power so that we could pick up the torch and continue the work. I wish we could continue that work with Bob, but I'm grateful and I'm hopeful for the army of people that he has empowered while he was with us. Thank you, Bob. We won't let you down.
Vivian Satterfield works as Director of Strategic Partnerships at Verde, devoted to nonprofit community building, a commitment she shared with Bob. Vivian?
Hi there. I'm Vivian Satterfield, and I was asked so graciously by the Stacey family and the friends who organized this to just share some thoughts, for which the gravity of who I'd be talking about and who I'd be delivering these comments in front of has, the gravity of that's just dawned upon me now. It's the naivete of youth. So I moved to Oregon in 2008 from Chicago, and when I first moved to Portland, Oregon, I actually didn't know where Portland was. I thought it was on the coast, and I'd be by water, and I'd be a little bit closer to where my family lives, where they lived, in Shanghai, China. So I really knew nothing about Portland. I knew nothing about my new home, and again, naivete of youth. Thought it'd be a great place to check it out for a few years, and if it didn't work out, well, I had plenty of places I could probably go to. But I quickly fell in love with Portland. I learned how to camp outside. I mean, I'm a total city kid, you all, from the city of Chicago. So like, I'd never slept outside. I begged my mother once to let me sleep outside on the back deck, overlooking the alleyway and where all the trash dumpsters were, and learned to ride my bike by following a crack in the alley. So I'd never been camping, never been hiking, much less seen the sort of vistas and incredible natural resources we have here. And I know my life is forever changed because of, I'm realizing the work of Bob Stacey and so many of you to preserve a lot of these natural resources. One of my favorite things to do is to swim across the Willamette, and I'm able to do that in my swimsuit and feel completely comfortable and free doing so because of the work of so many of you. So thank you. You've inspired generations of people to explore and to love Oregon as I have. And so I didn't know about Bob Stacey's contributions when I started doing some community organizing around transit service and transit users. And I was really interested in working alongside people who had similar backgrounds to me. I'm a daughter of an immigrant. I grew up in an urban environment, and I didn't go to grad school. I don't have an advanced degree, but I'm really passionate about my community and want to make any place that I'm in as holistic and as serving as it can be to all people who live here, especially those who are disempowered, especially those who don't know how to navigate our systems, which are very complex, and who never have had a political voice or political power. And so I came to first meet Bob Stacey on the Powell Division Project, where I was organizing transit riders who were quite excited about the prospect of having better service and greater access to opportunity in a part of town where many, many folks have been displaced to due to gentrification and displacement, and where I also was a fixed income, low income renter, trying to understand how we could have greater influence on the decisions that really shape people's lives. And so I didn't meet Bob Stacey as a counselor. I met him as an older gentleman who was really interested and curious about how people thought and what their lived experiences were. It wasn't until later I realized, well, this is an elected official. This is a guy with power. And I think that speaks a lot to what so many of you have shared about Bob's personability, his approach to the work, and his genuine interest in, again, how people think and why. And so I've come to know Bob Stacey throughout my own community organizing and spending a lot of time in council chambers here trying to urge those with power and with a voice to expand the periphery of their thinking and what's possible. So I asked a few of my peers in preparation for today what are some of their favorite memories of Bob, or what was the impact that his life of service has had on them. And so, two of them actually are incoming Metro counselors, both Ashton Simpson and Duncan Huang, send their regrets that they can't be here today. But Duncan shared that if it were not for Bob Stacey's leadership and his steadfast support for the vision that the community had around the Jade District and 82nd Avenue, that perhaps it wouldn't have been as successful. Perhaps they wouldn't have pushed so hard had it not been for a leader who was willing to say, yes, we can do it. Yes, we're interested in seeing what your vision for this community can be. And so I think a lot of the successes of that community, and that's my neighborhood, can be attributed to his leadership and having the audacity to say yes when community is leading. I asked my colleague, Jenny Lee at the Coalition of the Communities of Color, if she had any thoughts to share. And many of you shared that a lot about Bob's, his legacy in planning and his work at many different levels of government. And I think that planners have a lot of power and they have a great responsibility and they have audacity, and I say that in the most positive way possible, to wield that tool because it has consequences. And I think that you all know that it takes guts to use the tools that you have to plan. And a lot of folks are not always willing to recognize the impact that it has when there might be some negatives. You may only think about the positive aspects or only highlight what worked, but Bob Stacey was willing to reflect on harm that was caused by his work in the 90s and was able to publicly recognize that. And for my colleague Jenny Lee, representing the Coalition of Communities of Color, that moment in which he was able to do that, and he likely didn't think much about saying much about the gravity of that, it brought her to tears. And I think that it's both about having the audacity to do, but also the humility to acknowledge what the impacts are, all of it. And Bob was able to hold all of that, and I admire him greatly for doing so. Ashton Simpson, as an incoming Metro counselor, a lot of us learn so much about our transportation systems and politics and how ballot measures work or don't work through the T2020 process. And Bob, alongside many of the council at that time, really recognized that they needed to develop leaders in our communities and took the time to describe what Metro does, how it works, really how it works, not just the legislative process, but really truly how it works and how to work alongside people who are making these decisions. And I think that his continued cultivation of leaders is exactly why I was asked to come here today and to share with you a little bit about our experiences and a little bit about how he really was an ambassador for the land use system, an ambassador for stepping into leadership, to be an elected official. And thanks, Bob. You're a real one.
So I'm told that there are refreshments, but I can't tell you where they're going. Oh, I see, Mary Kyle is nodding downstairs. So if you go and you mingle down there, and you notice as you circulate through the room, there are these little pockets of laughter, that's where Bob is. Thank you for coming.